The weight of Naomi Carter's carry-on bag was nothing compared to the weight of everything she had endured to reach this moment. As she strode through the airport, her heels clicking against the polished floor, she exhaled, letting the tension slowly drain from her shoulders. This trip wasn't just a vacation, it was a milestone. A symbol of everything she had fought for, sacrificed for, and earned. For years, Naomi had poured herself into her career, navigating a corporate world that often felt designed to keep women like her out. She had been the only black woman in countless boardrooms, her voice dismissed in meetings, her ideas later repackaged and claimed by others. She had been underestimated, overlooked, and subtly, sometimes not so subtly, pushed aside. Yet she had never let it stop her. Every late night spent fine-tuning proposals. Every weekend sacrificed to prove her worth. Every moment she swallowed her frustration to maintain her composure. It had all led here. To success. To a career that had finally granted her the respect she had fought for. To a paycheck that allowed her to book a first-class ticket without hesitation. She deserved this. As she approached the VIP lounge, the automated doors slid open with a quiet whoosh, revealing plush seating, soft lighting, and the quiet hum of conversation. Naomi scanned the room, taking in the polished shoes, designer luggage, and the air of exclusivity. Years ago, she might have hesitated before stepping inside, unsure if she truly belonged. Now, she walked in with quiet confidence, knowing she had every right to be there. She checked her watch. A 2-hour layover before boarding. Plenty of time to sink into a leather chair, sip a cappuccino, and breathe. As she settled into her seat, her mind drifted back to the start of her journey. She had grown up in a modest neighborhood, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a mechanic. Her parents had instilled in her a work ethic so unshakable it had become part of her very being. "You'll have to work twice as hard to get half as far," her mother used to say. Naomi had never resented that truth, she had embraced it. From the moment she stepped into the corporate world, she had known the odds were stacked against her. She had seen less qualified colleagues rise faster, their mistakes forgiven, their mediocrity excused. She had endured microaggressions that cut deep, jokes about how articulate she was. The way people marveled at her poise. The assumptions that she wasn't the one in charge, even when she was leading the meeting. Still, she had risen. She had learned to advocate for herself, to demand recognition, to own her accomplishments without shrinking to make others comfortable. She had built something real, something no one could take away from her. And yet, even now, sitting in first class, she felt a familiar knot in her stomach. Because no matter how much she achieved, how many accolades she earned, there was always that lingering whisper in the back of her mind. The reminder that people would still look at her and wonder if she belonged. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. A message from her best friend. "Camille. Enjoy this vacation. Babe, you earned every second of it. Love you." Naomi smiled, shaking off the doubt. Camille was right. This trip was hers. A well-earned reward. A chance to relax without worrying about deadlines, presentations, or proving herself. After a while, the soft chime of the intercom announced her boarding group. Naomi grabbed her bag, walking towards the gate with the same confidence that had carried her through every challenge. As she handed over her boarding pass, she could already imagine the feeling of sinking into her first-class seat, a glass of champagne in hand. A warm towel offered before takeoff. The quiet luxury of a space designed for comfort. She had dreamed of this moment. Stepping onto the plane, she took a breath, savoring the plush carpet beneath her feet, the soft murmur of attendants welcoming passengers. This was a far cry from the cramped economy seats she had spent years enduring. She found her seat and slid into it, feeling the weight of her exhaustion begin to lift. She had worked hard for this. She deserved this. But just as she closed her eyes, ready to let herself finally relax, a voice interrupted. "Excuse me, ma'am, there's been a seating issue. I need you to move." Naomi opened her eyes, blinking in confusion. "I'm sorry," she said, sitting up straighter. The flight attendant gave her an almost apologetic smile. But there was something behind it, something practiced. Something that made Naomi's stomach clench. "We need you to switch seats." Naomi frowned, pulling out her ticket, her name clearly printed on the first-class assignment. I'm in the right seat. The attendant hesitated, just a fraction of a second too long. And then Naomi saw him. A man, a white man in a business suit, standing just a few feet away. He wasn't elderly, he wasn't injured, he wasn't in any obvious distress. And yet, Naomi could feel the weight of expectation in the air. She knew what this was. She had seen this exact scene play out in boardrooms, in networking events, in social gatherings, the unspoken assumption that her space, her success, was always less certain, that someone else's comfort would always take priority over hers. The flight attendant's polite tone did nothing to soften the message. Please, ma'am, we need your cooperation. Naomi felt her breath catch in her throat. The vacation she had longed for, the seat she had paid for, the moment she had envisioned, it was all being challenged in an instant. And in that moment, every battle she had fought to get here came rushing back. The promotions she had clawed her way to earn. The hours of extra work to prove she was good enough. The meetings where she had been ignored, only to hear her ideas repackaged by someone else. And now, even here, in the seat she had earned, she was being asked to move. Naomi could feel it, the silent test hanging in the air. Would she comply? Would she shrink herself once again? Let them take this from her just because it was easier? Or would she stand her ground? Her fingers tightened around the armrests. And just like that, she made her decision. No, I'm not moving. The tension thickened. The air in the first-class cabin shifted. Passengers nearby turned, sensing the quiet confrontation. But Naomi didn't waver, because this seat wasn't just about luxury. It was about everything she had fought for. And she wasn't giving it up. Not now, not ever. Naomi sat back in her first-class seat, exhaling as she let herself relax for the first time in months. The cool leather felt luxurious against her skin. The gentle hum of the plane's engines a soothing backdrop to her thoughts. A flight attendant moved gracefully down the aisle, checking passenger seats, adjusting trays, offering warm towels. Naomi smiled to herself. She had earned this. Then, a shadow fell over her. A flight attendant stood beside her, hands clasped in front of her apron, her polished smile not quite reaching her eyes. Something about her posture, something practiced, something hesitant, sent a quiet alarm through Naomi's body. Excuse me, ma'am, the attendant said smoothly. There's been a seating issue. We need you to move. Naomi blinked. Move? She sat up straighter, gripping the armrests. I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. She reached into her bag, pulling out her boarding pass, tapping the assigned seat number with her perfectly manicured nail. No mistake, the flight attendant said, her smile unwavering. But Naomi noticed the flicker of something in her eyes, something that told Naomi she wasn't expecting a fight. I'm in the right seat, Naomi stated, her voice calm but firm. This is my ticket. I paid for this seat. There was a beat of silence. And then, Naomi saw him. A white man, tall, impeccably dressed in a navy blue business suit, his silver watch gleaming under the cabin lights. He was standing a few rows away, watching the exchange with thinly veiled impatience. Unlike Naomi, he wasn't asked to show his ticket. No one questioned whether he belonged. Naomi's heart clenched. She knew exactly what this was. It wasn't about a seating mix-up. It was about the silent rules that existed in places like this. Places where women like Naomi, no matter how successful, how accomplished, were still seen as outsiders. The flight attendant shifted slightly, her professional demeanor slipping just a fraction. We just need your cooperation. Ma'am. Cooperation. A word Naomi had heard too many times before. A word used to smooth over injustice, to make oppression more palatable. She glanced around, sensing the weight of watchful eyes. Some passengers were looking away, pretending not to notice. Others were leaning forward ever so slightly, caught between curiosity and discomfort. The businessman, however, did not look uncomfortable. He looked expectant, like a man who had never been denied anything in his life. Naomi's fingers curled into fists on the armrests. Why'd I need to move? She asked, her voice measured but sharp. The flight attendant hesitated. The gentleman has a tight connection and... So do I. Naomi interrupted. Her voice was steady, but inside, something was burning. The flight attendant blinked. It was clear she hadn't prepared for pushback. I understand, ma'am, but we're just trying to make things easier for everyone. Everyone. The word felt like a slap. Easier for who? Naomi's mind flashed back to every time she had been asked, directly or indirectly, to move. To step aside. To make space for someone else. The conference rooms where she had to fight for a seat at the table. The meetings where she was spoken over. The networking events where people assumed she wasn't the one in charge. And now, here she was again, in a space she had earned. A space she had paid for. And still, being asked to move. She took a breath. No, she said simply. The flight attendant stiffened. I'm sorry? Naomi met her gaze, unflinching. I said no, I'm not moving. I paid for this seat. And I have just as much right to be here as anyone else. The businessman let out a sharp breath. Like this was an inconvenience to him. Passengers began murmuring. A few rows back, a woman with salt and pepper hair shifted uncomfortably. A middle-aged man in a sweater frowned at his laptop, clearly trying to ignore what was happening. Naomi could feel it now. The tension. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. This was a moment of reckoning. The flight attendant's polite mask began to crack. Please don't make this difficult. Difficult. Because she wasn't complying. Because she wasn't shrinking. Naomi let out a slow breath. I'm not making this difficult. I'm sitting in the seat I paid for. Her words landed heavily, reverberating through the air. The businessman sighed loudly, exasperated. Can we just get this over with? Naomi turned toward him, her rage ice cold. Over with? She echoed. Why don't you move, then? His face reddened. He glanced at the flight attendant, expecting her to restore order. She hesitated. For the first time since this exchange began. She looked uncertain. Because now, people were watching. Because now, the unspoken power dynamics had been laid bare. Because now, the mask had slipped. The weight of it all hung heavy in the air. Passengers were waiting, holding their breath. And Naomi? Naomi was done waiting. I suggest we move forward. She said, voice steady. Because I am not moving. Not today. The businessman clenched his jaw. The flight attendant swallowed hard. And somewhere in the silence, someone clapped. Just once. The smallest ripple of defiance. Naomi felt it like a current. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been told, subtly or directly, that they didn't belong. It was about every unspoken rule that demanded people like her step aside. Not today. Not this time. She had worked too hard. She had come too far. And she wasn't going anywhere. Naomi Carter's heart pounded in her chest. But she refused to let it show. She had been here before. In different places. Under different circumstances. Told she was too ambitious. Too confident. Too much for a world that wasn't built with her in mind. But this time, it wasn't a boardroom dismissing her ideas. It wasn't a networking event where she was mistaken for an assistant instead of a leader. This time, it was her seat, her space, her right being questioned. The businessman, still standing, shifted impatiently. His exasperation was palpable, as if Naomi's mere existence in first class was an inconvenience to him. He wasn't used to waiting. He was used to things being handed to him. And now, he expected her to step aside. The flight attendant's forced politeness was slipping. Ma'am, we really need your cooperation. Cooperation. The word stung. How many times had she heard that before? When she was passed over for a promotion because the company wasn't ready for a woman of color in leadership. When she was expected to train a new colleague, only to watch him be promoted ahead of her. When she was told, time and time again, to be patient, to play the game, to wait her turn, as if fairness was something she had to earn beyond her achievements. Naomi had complied her whole life. Not today. No, she repeated, her voice like steel. I'm not moving. The businessman let out a sharp breath. A sigh that reeked of entitlement. Oh, come on, he muttered under his breath. This is ridiculous. Naomi turned her head slowly, locking eyes with him. What's ridiculous? She asked. Her voice dangerously calm. That I'm sitting in first class? That I'm not stepping aside for you? The man didn't answer. Because he didn't have to. The answer was already written on his face. The tension in the cabin had thickened. Other passengers were watching now. Some pretending not to. Others staring openly. A young couple in the row had exchanged uneasy glances. A middle-aged man, dressed in business casual, cleared his throat and looked away. No one wanted to get involved. And then, from the back of the cabin, a voice spoke. She's right. The words weren't loud, but they cut through the thick air like a blade. Naomi turned to see an older woman, her silver hair neatly pinned back, looking at the flight attendant. She paid for that seat. Why should she move? The flight attendant's smile faltered. We're just trying to accommodate everyone, she said, though even she didn't seem convinced anymore. The older woman shook her head. No, you're trying to accommodate him. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Small, quiet, but undeniable. Naomi's pulse thrummed. For so long, she had fought these battles alone. She had learned that you couldn't always count on allies, that sometimes people believed in fairness, but only when it was convenient. But today, she wasn't alone. The businessman was growing visibly uncomfortable now, shifting in place as the scrutiny turned on him. For the first time, he was being made to feel like the outsider. The flight attendant hesitated, glancing toward the front of the cabin, toward the supervisor. A tall, middle-aged man in a navy suit, standing near the cockpit, observing the scene, and then, he stepped forward. What seems to be the issue? The flight attendant hurried to explain. The businessman crossed his arms, his face tight with frustration. Naomi sat still, watching, waiting. The supervisor turned to her, his expression unreadable. Miss Carter, he said, glancing at the manifest in his hand. We understand there's been some confusion. We'd like to resolve this as quickly as possible. His tone was calm, too calm. Naomi had sat through enough meetings to recognize that tone. It was the voice of a man who wanted her to be quiet, to comply, to disappear. She met his gaze evenly. There's no confusion, she said. This is my seat. I paid for it. I'm not moving. Silence. The supervisor shifted, then exhaled slowly. We don't want this to escalate. Naomi's jaw tightened. Escalate? She repeated. I'm sitting in my assigned seat. I'm not raising my voice. I'm not causing a disturbance. The only people escalating this situation are the ones asking me to move. The supervisor's lips pressed into a thin line. Naomi saw the moment he realized he had lost. Because now, everyone was watching. Because now, he couldn't justify removing her without admitting the ugly truth of it all. Because now, his authority had been challenged. And she hadn't blinked. The businessman let out a frustrated scoff, shaking his head as if he had been wronged. He turned abruptly and marched back to his own seat, slamming his briefcase into the overhead compartment. The flight attendant didn't speak again. The supervisor straightened his tie, his gaze flickering away as he gave Naomi a curt nod. Enjoy your flight, Miss Carter. And just like that, it was over. Or at least, this battle was. Naomi exhaled, her fingers slowly unclenching from the armrests. The cabin slowly returned to normal, the hum of conversations resuming. The rustle of newspapers, the flight attendants preparing for takeoff. But something had shifted. The businessman's discomfort hadn't gone unnoticed. And neither had Naomi's defiance. As the plane lifted off, Naomi leaned back into her seat. She had won this fight. But deep down, she knew, it was never just about this seat. It was about every seat, every space, every moment in her life where she had been told to move. And today, she had finally said no. She closed her eyes, exhaling. For once, she wasn't just holding her place. She was claiming it. Naomi Carter remained seated, her breath slow and steady. But inside, her heart pounded like a drum. The tension in the cabin had become suffocating, thick as a storm cloud before the first crack of thunder. She could feel the weight of every gaze, some sympathetic, some hostile, and others frozen in uncertainty. The hush that had settled over first class was deafening, louder than any argument could have been. Then, the murmurs started. Why can't she just move? A voice from a few rows back. Low but insistent. Naomi didn't turn, but she felt the sting of it. The impatience. The dismissal. The casual cruelty. Another voice. Firmer this time. She's right. She paid for that seat. It was the older woman who had spoken before. Naomi wanted to turn and thank her. But she kept her gaze forward. She needed to hold her ground. A man across the aisle exhaled sharply, closing his laptop with an audible snap. His frustration radiated like heat. Look, we're all trying to get somewhere, he said, his voice dripping with irritation. This flight is already behind schedule. Just let the guy have the seat so we can go. Naomi finally turned her head, locking eyes with him. Would you? She asked. Her voice even. The man blinked, caught off guard. Would you just give up your seat if someone told you to? She continued. If you had paid for it? If you had earned it? His jaw tightened. He didn't answer, because he knew the truth. He would never be asked to move. He would never have to justify his place. The whispers grew louder. Some passengers nodded in agreement with Naomi. Others shook their heads, muttering under their breath. A young woman 2 rows ahead pulled out her phone, discreetly recording the scene. Naomi wasn't surprised. This was the kind of injustice that had been hidden for too long, but in today's world, truth had a way of coming to light. The businessman, the man who had sparked this whole ordeal, let out a dramatic sigh. Crossing his arms. This is unbelievable, he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Naomi let out a slow breath, fighting the urge to roll her eyes. Unbelievable? No. What was unbelievable was how easily people like him assumed they had the right to take what wasn't theirs. What was unbelievable was how people watching this unfold were more bothered by the inconvenience than the injustice. What was unbelievable was that she had to fight for a seat she had already won. A new voice cut through the growing tension. A young black woman, seated toward the back of first class, finally spoke. I've been in her shoes before. The cabin went still. All eyes turned toward her. She lifted her chin, voice steady despite the nerves written across her face. This isn't about the seat, she continued. It never is. It's about making her feel like she doesn't belong here. A murmur of agreement rippled through a small section of the passengers. A quiet resistance was forming. But others weren't so willing to listen. Oh, come on, a man in a business suit scoffed. Not everything is about race. Sometimes things just happen. Naomi turned toward him. Her voice was calm, but her words carried fire. You're right, she said. Sometimes things just happen. Like me working twice as hard to get here. Like me following the rules. Paying for this seat. Boarding this plane, and still being told I don't belong. Like me having to fight for something that should never have been questioned in the first place. The man had no response. He couldn't respond because deep down, he knew she was right. The silence stretched. The flight attendant stood frozen, torn between following orders and acknowledging the shift happening around her. The supervisor, who had tried to handle this quietly, looked less certain now. Naomi could feel it. The tides were turning, and then something incredible happened. A middle-aged woman, dressed in a sleek gray pantsuit, reached for her call button. The soft ding echoed through the cabin. A flight attendant rushed over. Yes, ma'am? The woman pointed toward Naomi. She's right. This is wrong, and I'd like to file a formal complaint against how she's being treated. The flight attendant's eyes widened. Another passenger pressed their call button. Then another. The businessman's face turned red with frustration. You've got to be kidding me, he muttered. Naomi turned toward him, a small, victorious smile touching her lips. Not this time, the supervisor sighed, rubbing his temple. He had lost. Naomi had won, and the businessman, so sure that he could take what wasn't his, finally realized it with a muttered curse under his breath. He stormed off, taking a seat somewhere in the back. The tension broke. Passengers exhaled, shifting in their seats. The energy in the cabin had changed. Naomi didn't just keep her seat. She kept her dignity, her right to exist in that space, unquestioned, unchallenged, and for the first time in a long time, she felt seen. She looked around, meeting the gazes of the people who had spoken up, who had stood with her. Even in the smallest ways she nodded in gratitude, a silent thank you. The older woman who had defended her earlier gave her a knowing smile. I hope you enjoy your flight, dear. Naomi exhaled, the fight leaving her shoulders. I will. She said, and this time she meant it. What do you think? Naomi stood her ground. Even when others told her to step aside. She didn't just win her seat, she won respect. But the reality is, this story isn't just fiction. It's real. It happens every day in different ways. To different people. Would you have spoken up? Would you have supported Naomi? Leave a comment below and let us know your thoughts. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories like this, because the more we talk about it, the closer we get to real change. Naomi sat still, her fingers curled tightly around the armrests. The weight of the moment pressed down on her. But she would not let it break her. Not this time. Not ever again. She had fought too hard to be here, to sit in this seat, to claim the space she had rightfully earned, but now the real battle was about to begin. The flight attendant had disappeared moments ago, leaving Naomi in the eye of a storm brewing around her. The whispers had grown louder, the stares more blatant. Some passengers looked at her with quiet support, others with open disdain, and some simply pretended not to see, retreating into the safe cocoon of their own privilege, because that was easier. Because standing up against something unfair meant acknowledging it was real in the first place. And then she saw them. Security. 2 officers stepped onto the plane. Their presence a silent warning. The cabin held its breath. The businessman, the man who had tried to take what wasn't his, sat back in his seat, his lips twitching with the ghost of a self-satisfied smirk. He didn't even have to say anything anymore. The world had always worked in his favor. He knew the system would handle this for him. Naomi had seen this play out before. In different settings, in different ways, but this time she would not be erased. One of the officers, tall and broad-shouldered, approached her seat. His expression was unreadable, professional, detached. He wasn't here to ask questions. He was here to remove a problem. Ma'am, we've been asked to escort you off the plane. The words sent a ripple through the cabin. A sharp intake of breath from a woman nearby. A muttered, Jesus Christ, from a man across the aisle. But Naomi didn't move. She let the silence stretch, her gaze never wavering. Then, slowly, deliberately, she spoke. Give me a legitimate reason why I should move. The officer hesitated. The businessman frowned. The passengers leaned in. This wasn't what was supposed to happen. Naomi was supposed to comply. She was supposed to make it easy for them. She was supposed to shrink, but Naomi had spent too many years shrinking, and now she was standing her ground, even from her seat. The second officer, stockier, less patient, stepped forward. Ma'am, we're not here to debate this. The airline has asked that you move to accommodate another passenger. Naomi's lips parted, her voice clear as glass, sharp as steel. A passenger who has no more right to this seat than I do. The taller officer shifted on his feet, but the stockier one squared his shoulders, preparing to exert authority. If you refuse to comply, you'll be removed. A collective shudder passed through the cabin. Naomi felt it, but she refused to let it shake her. She looked at the officers, her voice unwavering. So, let me understand this clearly. You're saying that even though I paid for this seat, even though I have followed every airline policy, you are going to physically remove me because this man wants what isn't his? Silence. 1 heartbeat. 2. Then, another voice broke the quiet. This is wrong. The older woman who had defended Naomi earlier spoke up again, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. You can't do this to her. She hasn't done anything wrong. A murmur of agreement spread like wildfire. Another voice, the young black woman in the back. If she gets kicked off this plane, it's because you decided to let discrimination win. The businessman's smug expression faltered. He was losing control of the narrative. Security was supposed to come in, drag Naomi out, and the world would move on as if nothing had happened. But now there were witnesses, people who weren't looking away, passengers who were starting to question, starting to see the truth in Naomi's resistance. The stocky officer looked unsure now. He wasn't just dealing with an unruly passenger. He was dealing with a moment that could spiral beyond his control. His radio crackled. A quiet instruction from the airline supervisor. He hesitated, then he stepped back. The businessman's jaw tightened, his knuckles white where they gripped the armrest. We won't be removing her. The words were small, but they shook the entire cabin. The older woman let out a quiet breath of relief. The young black woman nodded, Her eyes burning with something fierce and unshakable. Naomi closed her eyes for half a second, not in gratitude. In victory she had stood her ground, and for once the system had no choice but to listen. The businessman let out an angry scoff. But no one cared. He had lost. And he knew it. Security turned and exited the plane, their presence fading like a storm that never quite arrived. The flight attendant, the same one who had tried to remove her, cleared her throat, her voice suddenly a fraction softer. "Can I get you anything, Miss Carter?" Naomi lifted her chin, exhaling slowly. "A glass of water," she said, and just like that, the plane moved forward. The tension remained, but the battle had been won. For every time she had been told to step aside, for every room where she had been made to feel small, for every moment she had questioned if she had the right to stand her ground, this time, she had not moved. She would never move again. "What do you think?" Naomi's strength wasn't just in her refusal. It was in her ability to hold her space when the world told her she didn't belong. This isn't just a story. It's a reality for so many people. Would you have stood up for Naomi? Have you ever witnessed something unfair like this? Comment below and show your support. And if this story resonates with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful moments that need to be shared. Because when we speak up, when we stand together, when we refuse to move, we change the world. By the time the plane touched down, Naomi Carter knew her life would never be the same. She could feel it in the glances of the passengers as they gathered their belongings. Some were embarrassed, unable to meet her eyes. Others gave her small, almost imperceptible nods, silent acknowledgments of what had happened. The businessman who had tried to take her seat stormed off the plane without a word, his presence fading like a ghost of old power, something that no longer held weight in this moment. But Naomi didn't move. She stayed seated, steady, unshaken, victorious. She had fought for her place. And she would take her time before stepping back into the world that had tried to erase her. But the world had already seen her. She just didn't know it yet. The moment Naomi stepped off the plane, her phone buzzed violently in her pocket. Then again, and again. At first, she ignored it. She just wanted to get through baggage claim, to breathe in the air of freedom, to let her shoulders finally relax after hours of carrying the weight of the moment. But as she waited for her luggage, she finally glanced at her screen. And then, her breath caught in her throat. Her name was everywhere. Black woman refuses to give up first-class seat in shocking confrontation. A battle over privilege at 30,000 feet. Who really has the right to be here? She didn't move. And now, the internet is listening. It wasn't just a few posts. It was everywhere. Videos of the confrontation had been uploaded from multiple angles. People had captured her quiet strength, the way she had refused to back down even as authority loomed over her like a storm cloud. The image of her, sitting firmly in her seat, unflinching, had become a symbol of quiet resistance. She scrolled through the comments, her heart pounding. She's a queen. The way she just sat there? Iconic. It's 2025, and this is still happening. Wake up, people. This is what fighting for what's right looks like. But then, there were others. Why do people always make everything about race? She was being difficult on purpose. Just move. Another entitled woman looking for attention. Naomi inhaled sharply, the weight of it all pressing against her chest. She had known this would happen. She had seen it before, how the world turned women like her into debate topics, stripping away their humanity in favor of arguments and outrage. And yet, she felt something else beneath the noise. A shift, a spark, a movement growing in the shadows. Because it wasn't just her name trending. It was the conversation. People weren't just talking about Naomi. They were talking about the system. Who gets to take up space without question? Who is asked to move? Who is told, time and time again, that they don't belong? And why? As she walked through the airport, she felt the stares. Some from people who had already seen the video. Some from strangers who just sensed something had happened. And then, a voice behind her. "Excuse me." Naomi turned. A young black woman stood there, wide-eyed and nervous, clutching her phone as if debating whether or not to say more. I saw the video." Her voice trembled slightly. "I just wanted to say thank you For standing up. For not moving. Naomi's throat tightened. She had never done this for recognition. She had done it because she had no other choice. Because if she didn't stand her ground, who would? She nodded, her lips curving into a small but resolute smile. You belong here too, Naomi said softly. The woman exhaled, her expression shifting from nervousness to quiet determination. I know, she whispered, because of you. Naomi felt the impact of those words settle deep inside her chest. This moment, this was bigger than her. She had fought for her seat. And in doing so, she had given others permission to fight for theirs. She turned, walking toward the exit, head held high, shoulders squared. She didn't just hold her place on that plane. She had changed something. And now, the world was listening. By the time Naomi Carter walked through the airport terminal, she knew her life had changed forever. She had expected the confrontation on the plane to stay in that cabin. To remain a private moment of resistance, a fight she had won. But one that would soon be forgotten. But the world had been watching. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Message after message. Notifications from social media. Calls from numbers she didn't recognize. At first, she ignored it, her mind too exhausted to process anything beyond putting one foot in front of the other. She just wanted to collect her luggage, get home, and breathe. But as she walked through the airport, something felt different. The stares. Some were subtle, quick glances. Averted eyes when she caught them looking. Others were more direct, curious and knowing. And then, a woman stepped into her path. Naomi's heart skipped. The woman, young, early 20s, with nervous eyes and a hesitant smile, held up her phone. The screen was open to a video. Naomi's video. I saw what happened, the woman said, her voice shaking slightly. You don't know me, but I just wanted to say, thank you. Naomi stared at the phone, her own face frozen on the screen. Mid-confrontation, the clip had been paused at the exact moment she had refused to move, her posture straight. Her hands steady, her eyes locked with the man who had tried to take what wasn't his. She had become a symbol. The woman swallowed hard, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. I know that must have been hard. But because of you, I feel like I can stand up to. Naomi's chest tightened. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was bigger than a seat on a plane. She nodded, her throat too tight to form words. Instead, she reached out, gave the woman's hand a small but firm squeeze, then stepped away before her emotions betrayed her. But the moment haunted her. As she waited for her luggage, she finally gave in and unlocked her phone. And that's when she saw it. Her name was everywhere. Her face, her story, the confrontation, all of it had gone viral. Millions of views, thousands of comments. Naomi's breath caught. The world had taken notice. The video was being shared across platforms. News outlets were picking it up. Celebrities were retweeting it with captions like, "This is why we keep fighting." The hashtags flooded her screen. The video itself was a montage of moments, her refusal, the murmurs of passengers, the arrival of security, and finally, the moment the officers had backed down. The moment Naomi had won. The comments were a barrage of emotions. Some cheered her on. She is the definition of strength. We need more Naomi Carters in this world. I hope she knows how many people she's inspired today. This isn't just about one seat. This is about an entire system that needs to change. Others were filled with rage. This is what's wrong with the world. People like her just looking for a fight. She was being difficult on purpose. Just move. Why do people always have to make it about race? And some comments, the ones that stung the most, were cruel. Entitled woman playing the victim. Just another example of someone trying to make everything about oppression. I hope she never gets on a plane again. Naomi exhaled sharply, her grip tightening on her phone. She had expected this. The world had a way of turning black women into both warriors and villains. Often at the same time. She scrolled further, past the hate, past the ignorance, until she saw something else. Messages from women just like her. Women who had been told to step aside. Women who had been dismissed, ignored, underestimated. Women who had spent their lives shrinking to make others comfortable. And now, because of her, they weren't shrinking anymore. Naomi, you don't know me, but I needed this today. I needed to see someone like me take up space unapologetically. Thank you. You stood your ground. And in doing so, you stood up for all of us. You didn't move, and neither will we. Naomi's vision blurred with unshed tears. She hadn't just fought for herself that day. She had fought for all of them. And now, they were fighting back. She put her phone away and wiped her face, steadying herself. Because she wasn't done yet. Because the world had finally been forced to listen. As Naomi Carter walked away from the airport, suitcase in hand, she felt the weight of the past few days settle on her shoulders. The battle had been won, at least for now. She had refused to move. She had held her ground in a world that constantly tried to shrink her. And in doing so, she had become a symbol of quiet, unrelenting resistance. But deep down, she knew this wasn't the end. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane. This wasn't just about one confrontation at 30,000 feet. This was about every black person, every woman, every individual who had ever been told, explicitly or implicitly, that they didn't belong. Naomi's refusal to move was more than just a moment of defiance. It was a statement, a declaration that no one should ever have to justify their presence. That no one should have to fight for the right to exist in a space they rightfully earned. She didn't just claim her seat. She claimed her place in the world. And the world had no choice but to listen. A story that refused to be buried. As Naomi stepped into her apartment, the exhaustion from the day threatened to pull her under. But sleep wouldn't come easily. Her phone was still buzzing. Messages still flooding in. News stations were calling. Celebrities were tweeting. Activists were rallying behind her name. She had become a movement. Social media was ablaze with discussions about privilege, access, and the silent rules that dictated who belonged where. She didn't move, and she shouldn't have had to. A seat on a plane? Or a lifetime of being told to shrink? This isn't just about Naomi. This is about all of us. For every person who celebrated her, there was another trying to tear her down. Why does everything have to be about race? She was just being difficult for attention. Maybe if she had handled it better, it wouldn't have escalated. The gaslighting was nothing new. People who had never lived a day in her skin, never experienced a single moment of what it meant to fight for space, were suddenly experts on how she should have handled the situation. But Naomi didn't regret a single moment. She scrolled through her messages, her heart catching on the ones that mattered most. Because of you, I will never apologize for taking up space again. I needed this reminder today. Thank you for standing your ground. You didn't move, and neither will we. She exhaled, tears pressing at the corners of her eyes. She hadn't asked to be a symbol. But now, she had a responsibility to carry it forward. The ripple effect, a system forced to answer. In the days that followed, Naomi's story refused to die down. She received invitations to interviews, panel discussions, university lectures. Civil rights organizations reached out, wanting to support her in pushing for change. A petition began circulating, demanding airlines reassess their biases in first-class treatment and passenger displacement policies. The airline itself, silent at first, was now being forced to respond. The pressure was mounting. They issued a statement, polite but hollow, claiming they were conducting an internal review. But the people weren't buying it. The public wanted more than just empty words. They wanted change, the face of a new era. One night, Naomi sat on her balcony, staring at the city skyline, phone in hand. She had spent so long fighting just to be heard, just to be taken seriously, that now, with the world finally listening, she didn't know what to do next. And then, she realized, this was only the beginning. She opened Twitter and typed, "A seat isn't just a seat when the world constantly tells you that you don't belong. I didn't move, because I shouldn't have had to. No one should. This fight isn't just mine, it's all of ours." She hit send, and the movement exploded all over again. Thousands of people began sharing their own experiences. Black travelers who had been profiled at airports. Women who had been told to tone it down, to fit into corporate spaces. People of color who had been made to feel like guests in their own country. The conversation grew bigger than Naomi herself. It became a fight for recognition, for dignity, for justice, a lesson for the world, and for you. Naomi's story is a reminder to all of us. A reminder that silence doesn't change the world, action does. That refusing to move is more than just resistance, it's survival. That when one person stands their ground, they empower others to do the same. So, if you've ever been told to shrink, to be silent, to step aside, don't. If you've ever been made to feel like you didn't belong, you do. And if you've ever wondered whether standing up for yourself was worth it, it is. Because when we take up space, when we refuse to let the world push us aside, when we say, no, I will not move, we change everything. What can you do? This isn't just Naomi's fight. This is all of ours. Drop a comment below. Have you ever faced a moment like this? Have you ever witnessed someone being told they didn't belong? What would you have done? Hit that like button if you stand with Naomi. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that need to be told. Because this is just the beginning. And together, we will never move again.